History as it happens, November 7th, 2023. From 9/11 to 10/7, know your enemy.
Unprecedented and deadly surprise attack by Hamas this morning. The Palestinian militant group essentially invaded parts of Israel.
Israel has made clear its mission now is to strangle the life out of Gaza, cutting off all food, water and electricity.
Another large barrage of explosions has been reported in northern Gaza in the past hour.
Just as the United States would not agree to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after the terrorist attack of 9/11, Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th.
The Hamas terrorist attack that killed more than 1,400 Israelis drew comparisons to the al-Qaeda attacks on New York and Washington. For some, the comparison is meant to justify massive retaliation for as long as it takes in an existential war. For others, a warning about the limits of military power and revenge. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
That looks like a second plane.
In an apparent terrorist attack on our country. Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes.
Similarities, of course, it was a surprise attack. It was carried out by a terrorist group. It's going to be regarded as a hinge event in Israeli history, just as 9/11 was a hinge event in American history. When somebody's been attacked by surprise, they are far less likely to sort of be amenable to making a deal.
In 2002, a former Israeli prime minister testified before a House panel in Washington in support of a U.S. invasion of Iraq. Benjamin Netanyahu said violence was the way to deal with terrorism, and by invading Iraq, the U.S. would possibly plant seeds for democracy elsewhere in the region, kind of like a domino effect, but in a good way.
I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. And I think that people sitting right next door in Iran, young people, and many others will say, the time of such regimes, of such despots, is gone. There is a new age. Something new is happening.
And that is speculation on your part, or you have some evidence to that effect?
I was asked the same question in 1986. I had written a book in which I had said that the way to deal with terrorist regimes, with terror, was to deal with the terrorist regimes. And the way to deal with the terrorist regimes, among other things, was to apply military force against them.
The way we did in Afghanistan.
The way, for example, I want to answer your question.
I guess I'm running out of time, so I quickly was trying to get there. We've done, I think, what you proposed in Afghanistan, yet I haven't seen that sort of neighborhood effect.
Well, I think there's been an enormous effect. The effect was, we were told that there would be a contrary effect. First of all, people said that there would be tens of thousands of people streaming into Afghanistan, zealots who would be outraged by America's action, and this would produce a counter-reaction in the Arab world.
But I think you're now saying that when you take an action like we did in Afghanistan, we're going to see all the other countries just fold.
No, what we saw is something else. First of all, we saw everybody streaming out of Afghanistan. The second thing we saw is all the Arab countries and many Muslim countries trying to side with America, trying to be okay with America. The application of power is the most important thing in winning the war on terrorism. If I had to say, what are the three principles of winning the war on terror? It's like, what are the three principles of real estate, the three L's, location, location, location? The three principles of winning the war on terror are the three W's, winning, winning, and winning. The more victories you amass, the easier the next victory becomes. The first victory in Afghanistan makes the second victory in Iraq that much easier. The second victory in Iraq will make the third victory that much easier too, but it may change the nature of achieving that victory. It may be possible to have implosions taking place. I don't guarantee it, Mr. Turney, but I think it makes it more likely.
Well, I do think history has rendered a verdict on that fantasy. Well, now, more than 20 years later, and in his third stint as prime minister, Netanyahu is vowing to violently destroy Israel's terrorist enemies in language reminiscent of those early days of the global war on terrorism.
In fighting Hamas and the Iranian axis of terror, Israel is fighting the enemies of civilization itself. Victory over these enemies begins with moral clarity. It begins with knowing the difference between good and evil, between right and wrong.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
10/7 did evoke 9/11 in a number of ways. We can start with the sheer terror evinced by both attacks. For Americans, it was a new, unsettling sense of insecurity and fear, brought on by faceless, stateless enemies many had never heard of. Those memories, I was 26 at the time, viscerally returned when I watched video of President Biden meeting Israeli medics who responded to the carnage on 10/7.
We're spread around Israel. Our response is usually 90 seconds, and we were there in the first moments seeing the atrocities that happened. We saw women that were raped and then murdered, children, little babies that were torn around, taken away from their parents, murdered in front of their parents, heads chopped off. Our volunteers were brave. We have 2 volunteers who were murdered. One of them is an Arab, one Arab volunteer of United Hatzalah, and one Jewish volunteer of United Hatzalah. One was captured in 9 hours. He was tied to a pole while they were shooting other people. And we have 2 volunteers who are in Gaza now, captured by the terrorists, and 8 volunteers injured.
And in the days after 10/7, those images, those memories were all Israelis could think of. Just as after 9/11, every time you looked at a television, you saw a replay of the plane striking the Twin Towers. There are other similarities here in the way political leaders are framing the conflict of existential importance, pitting good versus evil, one in which we, our side, has the right to do whatever it takes. As George W. Bush explained in his address to a joint session of Congress 9 days after 9/11, our way of life was on the line, and it could take years to resolve the conflict.
Our response involves far more than instant retaliation and isolated strikes. Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign, unlike any other we have ever seen.
The 10/7 9/11 comparison could be wrong-headed too, because Israel will certainly want to avoid the mistakes the U.S. made in responding to terrorist attacks by a group it poorly understood, al-Qaeda, a threat that was poorly defined, but in an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty with vengeance on our minds, critical thinking would have to wait. President Biden, to his credit, made this point in his remarks in Israel a couple of weeks ago.
But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes. I'm the first U.S. president to visit Israel in time of war. I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership. There's always cost, but it requires being deliberate. It requires asking very hard questions. It requires clarity about the objectives and an honest assessment about whether the path you're on will achieve those objectives.
According to the Costs of War Project at Brown University, in the post-9/11 wars of choice, at least 940,000 people have died due to direct war violence. That includes armed forces on all sides of the conflicts, contractors, civilians, journalists, and humanitarian workers. Over 400,000 civilians have been killed in direct violence by all parties to these conflicts. About 3.5 million people have died indirectly in post-9/11 war zones, bringing the total death toll to at least 4.5 million and counting. Over 7,000 U.S. soldiers have died in the wars. And the 2 countries the U.S. invaded, Iraq and Afghanistan, wear the scars from decades of violence. Can anyone say the U.S. response to 9/11 worked? Well, here in early November 2023, it is impossible to know how long Israel's war against Hamas will last, or what will be its consequences. But I do have my doubts, as I've stated in recent episodes, as to whether there are any military solutions to the problems of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Peter Bergen is CNN's national security analyst. He is an expert on international terrorism, the author of many excellent books, most recently, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. And he is the host of a new podcast available on Audible and all major platforms, In the Room with Peter Bergen. And I consider him a friend, even though my long-winded questions sometimes bring him to tears. Peter Bergen, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Martin.
So what are your general thoughts on this comparison, that Israel's 9/11 was 10/7?
Well, similarities, of course, it was a surprise attack. It was carried out by a terrorist group. It's going to be regarded as a hinge event in Israeli history, just as 9/11 was a hinge event in American history. You know, we were just discussing Lord Andrew Roberts and General David Petraeus in their new book. I mean, one of the things they say in their book is surprise attacks are surprisingly common. And that is an interesting observation. But what they also say is when somebody's been attacked by surprise, they are far less likely to sort of be amenable to like making a deal. And so we certainly saw it with the U.S. reaction after 9/11, with the Taliban failure to hand over Osama bin Laden, that the Bush administration deposed the Taliban regime within 3 months. And then, of course, started talking about the Iraq war, literally the weekend of September 15th when they met at Camp David. They started talking about a possible campaign against Iraq. And, of course, that eventually did happen. Wars are inherently very unpredictable. There are some comparisons, and we will see how they hold up over time, because obviously we're right in the middle of the Israeli reaction to the events of October 7th.
Yeah, I think some of the comparisons are wrong-headed, and you did mention Andrew Roberts and General Petraeus. I will speak to Andrew Roberts in an upcoming episode about his new book on the history of conflict and how warfare has changed. We were chatting about that before we started recording here. I guess one comparison that bugs me is, well, what happened to us was so beyond the pale, which is true, of course, but now that justifies any action on our behalf against our enemy.
Let's sort of break that down a bit, because when the United States was attacked after 9/11, it was the first time that Article 5 had been invoked by the NATO alliance, the collective right to self-defense. Also, the United Nations passed a resolution within 2 days saying that essentially the United States can respond by any means necessary. So there was a very large international consensus around the United States. And of course, 41 countries actually fought with the United States in Afghanistan. So not just the 25 plus members of NATO, but also other countries, including, by the way, a small number of Arab troops from countries like Jordan and UAE. That's a pretty big difference. Obviously, Israel does have the right to self-defense, just like any country does.
Let me just interject quickly, Peter. I'm not an international attorney here, but Article 51 of the United Nations Charter talks about self-defense against state actors, not non-state actors.
Yeah, but you still have the right to self-defense. I mean, I'm not an international lawyer either, but I mean, the UN passed this resolution saying, obviously al-Qaeda was a non-state actor. I think on September 13th, United Nations passed a resolution saying that the United States had a right to act in its own self-defense by any means that it felt was appropriate. So in the case of Israel's response, obviously there's been a lot of international pushback about the scale of the response in Gaza. American allies around the Arab world and elsewhere are calling for some kind of humanitarian pause or even ceasefire. There's some similarities, but there's also some differences.
It's a question of what's effective in this context. The use of military force against terrorist organizations.
Well, I mean, also a huge difference between the U.S. war in Afghanistan against the Taliban and the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza. Afghanistan is a fairly sizable country. The biggest city at the time was Kabul, with a population of 500,000 because so many people had left during the Afghan civil war and during Taliban rule. So the sort of population densities between the war in Afghanistan versus the war in Gaza are completely different. And of course, most of the Taliban were headquartered in Kandahar, which was an even smaller city in southern Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is a largely rural, particularly then, was a very rural country. So when we saw large-scale fighting and bombing campaigns against al-Qaeda in Tora Bora, That's a virtually completely uninhabited area in the mountains of the eastern Afghanistan. And we saw, U.S. warplanes dropping 500-pound bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, and in one case, a 15,000-pound daisy cutter bomb. Again, the terrain is very different.
I was going to say, absolutely. I mean, Israel has dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on a refugee camp. And the debate as to whether it's deliberate or malevolent or what is Israel supposed to do when Hamas is hiding under a hospital. But we're talking about 10,000 Palestinian dead already in just a couple of weeks, if you believe those estimates.
And I'm not an international humanitarian lawyer. In the case of a war, civilian deaths are not against international humanitarian law. However, it's a question of proportionality, etc. And Hamas is hiding behind civilians. That's just a fact. On the other hand, Israel is taking out these targets and also killing considerable numbers of civilians. An interesting question would be, if you're a U.S. military officer conducting this operation, would you have different standards? I am not a U.S. military officer, but clearly there are large-scale civilian casualties, which is not unexpected because not only is it densely populated, but Hamas is hiding among the population.
I want to deal with a major difference between the two situations in a moment, and that is the United States did not really know its enemy on September 10th, 2001, with the exception of a few people working in the bin Laden unit in the CIA. And of course, you interviewed Osama bin Laden in the mid-1990s, and you heard him wage war or declare war on the United States, so maybe you knew the enemy. But Israel knows Hamas. We'll get to that in a moment. Here's one area where I think there is a valid comparison, a similarity, but it also could lead to some really serious errors. And that is the intimacy or closeness of what happened or the visceral nature of the event. The idea that the next morning you're waking up in a new reality, a new world. I think we all remember what that felt like on September 11th, September 12th. Alien sense of fear and insecurity in the United States. And even though Israel has been at war quite a bit since its founding in 1948 and has been surrounded by enemies since then, the Israeli Yossi Klein Halevi wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. And he's spent many, many years working on Israeli-Palestinian issues and the two-state solution or non-solution now. He said, none of the previous wars and terror assaults and missile barrages that I've lived through in my 4 decades as an Israeli has quite prepared me for this moment of rage, dread, uncertainty, and resolve. This is the first war I've experienced that seems existential. Not in an immediate sense, he writes. Israel will not disappear tomorrow if it fails to meet its stated goal of destroying Hamas. But Israelis intuitively understand that if this round of fighting ends with one more stalemate, then our military deterrence could be irretrievable. So what do you think of that sense in Israel that this is a new war, a new reality, or that the stakes this time are really larger than they've been?
I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th, and I certainly recall the shock and the horror. And I also recall, for weeks afterwards, there were armored vehicles on the streets of Washington, and it was sort of eerily quiet. And so, yes, obviously this attack on October 7th was very shocking to Israelis. And I think that raises a number of issues, Martin. One is there are multiple different clocks ticking here at the same time. One is the negotiating for the hostages, of which only 4 have been released, and there are 240 plus that are still being held. Hostage negotiations are always complex and lengthy. That's one clock. Then another clock is the Israeli domestic political clock. And clearly there's a great desire amongst almost all Israelis to avenge what happened on October 7th. Then there's also the international clock with the United States trying to pressure Israel for a humanitarian pause, and other countries pressuring Israel for a ceasefire. Then there's the military clock. How long do these operations actually take? If you look at the U.S. fight against ISIS in Mosul, U.S. supported, led by Iraqi security services, that took 9 months.
Well, it seems clear that this won't be another episode of what Israel has called mowing the grass, periodic outbreaks of violence between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, that this operation's going to be months.
And that's my question. From a military point of view, it could well take months, but from a political point of view, can it take months? I think that you look back on Operation Protective Edge, which is in 2014 in Gaza, The whole operation took about 50 days. Obviously started with airstrikes, and then there were ground operations. It remains to be seen. I mean, from a military point of view, this kind of urban warfare operation, yes, which should take months. Do the Israelis have months to do this, but given all the international pressure on them? I don't know.
Something else that I've been thinking about too, Peter. I've been going back to my memory and the emotions of those days after 9/11 and how it was easy to get caught up in a sense of mission, civilizational mission. And I just reread and listened to President George W. Bush's speech to the joint session of Congress on September 20th. Looking back on it now, it just seems, so mistaken, but at the time, it made so much sense. I'll share a couple with you. He says here, our nation has been put on notice. We are not immune from attack. So to my earlier point about how this was kind of new, alien, unfamiliar place for the United States to be in. He also says,
this is not, however, just America's fight. And what is at stake is not just America's freedom. This is the world's fight. This is civilization's fight. This is the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom.
He also said, great harm has been done to us.
We have suffered great loss. And in our grief and anger, we have found our mission and our moment. Freedom and fear are at war. The advance of human freedom, the great achievement of our time and the great hope of every time, now depends on us. Our nation, this generation, will lift a dark thread of violence from our people and our future. We will rally the world to this cause by our efforts, by our courage. We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail.
So as I listened back to this, I thought of just how badly we actually misjudged the moment. Al-Qaeda was a small organization.
Yeah, I mean, it was a small organization on 9/11. We now know there were about 170 members, although there were thousands of al-Qaeda members that had gone through its training camps. And of course, al-Qaeda also then started having affiliates around the Middle East, including in North Africa and Yemen and other places. And eventually, of course, Iraq, which was precipitated by the Iraq War. Obviously, Israel has been under attack from Hamas through rocket attacks, etc., and fought a war with Hezbollah in 2006. And obviously 1973 war, Egypt and Syria attacked. Israel's had these kinds of either countries or non-state terrorist groups attacking it one way or another. So the United States didn't have that. So one of the reasons 9/11 was so shocking was the last time the United States had been directly attacked on the continental mainland is when the British burned down the White House in the War of 1812. But then, October 7th, the fact that so much of these massacres was videotaped, and I think that's had a big influence on the way Israelis see things, not just the attack itself, but also the fact that so much of this was filmed by Hamas. But another interesting thing is, George W. Bush on September 10th was not a well-liked president. On September 12th of that week, his favorability ratings went up to 91%. It was the highest favorable for any American president since these polls had been taken. I think with Netanyahu, it's a very different matter. I mean, I think Netanyahu is not well liked on the right or the left, and he's seen by a lot of Israelis as having let his country down by making certain presumptions about Hamas that turned out to be untrue. So usually there's a rally around the flag effect, around the leadership. But in Netanyahu's case, he had a former unity government because I think he knew that he was politically pretty toxic, both on the Israeli right and the Israeli left. As we keep talking about the similarities and the differences, I keep coming back to some differences, not least that, of course, the attack on the Taliban took place 6,000 miles from the United States, whereas this attack is happening within Israeli-occupied territory, which is controlled by Hamas.
And the history is entirely different.
Yeah.
The 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza have a much different historical relationship to Israel than did the al-Qaeda dudes who are running around the world.
Yeah, and Hamas also, unlike the Taliban, was elected in 2006 and then in 2007 sort of seized power from the Palestinian Authority and hasn't had any elections since. So unlike, say, al-Qaeda, which is just a terrorist organization, Hamas employs terrorism, but is also a kind of quasi-state. which I think also makes Israel's response much more complicated because let's say you do destroy Hamas, well then who's going to run Gaza the day the guns fall silent? It's going to be very hard to find credible security personnel amongst the Palestinian population that they will accept, that Israel will accept. And there's been very little discussion about what the day after looks like.
Well, the Palestinian Authority is discredited in the eyes of many Palestinians. Some have said that essentially it's now a de facto arm of Israeli security in the West Bank. The title of this episode is Know Your Enemy. Most Americans had never really heard of Osama bin Laden or al-Qaeda before 9/11. There were some things in the late 90s, early 2000s, the USS Cole, the bombings in Africa, and bin Laden's name was in the news, but for the most part, people didn't really know what we're dealing with here. Israel is different, and to your point about Netanyahu's unpopularity, the attack on 10/7 did shatter an illusion that Gaza could be basically kept as a prison and that Israel could then go and mow the grass every once in a while. That's the terminology they use. And that Israel could enjoy security while Palestinians live in a desperate state with no horizon at all. But also, going back to the 1980s, Israel facilitated the rise of Hamas as a counterbalance to the Fatah movement that now runs the West Bank. The idea was these religious fanatics will just go to the mosques and leave us alone. And of course, Hamas came out of the first Intifada.
Yeah. There was a miscalculation about Hamas that money was flowing into Gaza from Qatar and Turkey, and Gazans were working in Israel, and that Hamas was sort of quiescent that they wouldn't do it, something like October 7th. And, which gets to a kind of question about intelligence failures and policy failures, because it's very easy for policymakers to say there was an intelligence failure. In fact, Netanyahu recently said it in a tweet, which he then withdrew. Intelligence officials are not policymakers. They're just providing intelligence and information to policymakers to make the best decisions. And so my guess is that once there is a commission that looks into what happened, obviously it's not going to happen right now in the middle of this war, but the 9/11 Commission uncovered quite a lot of information that was in the system warning the Bush administration about something happening. I don't know if that's the case here with Gaza, but it's obviously easy to look for the signals once you're looking back. But we've had reports of the Egyptians giving Israel some sort of heads up about a possible operation by Hamas.
And then the possibility of something is happening has always been there, too.
Zooming out even further, it was really a policy failure to misunderstand that Hamas might be capable of something like this. And therefore, when you look at the intelligence, you just, if they're doing training exercises in Gaza, you just sort of say, well, they're just doing training exercises, and you just kind of process that as routine rather than training for some big operation.
Yeah. It's also been said that Hamas is not an ideology, it's a theology. Maybe there's really no difference between those two.
Well, it's a bunch of things, right? Yeah. It's because it's providing garbage service and it's providing services. So it's a quasi-state. It's a terrorist group. It's a religious, it has a very strong religious component. It comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt in the 20s and then founded in Palestine in 1945. In Jerusalem, their local branch, and so it has a very religious component as well. So it's all those things. It's a bit, in that sense, a bit like the Taliban, by the way, because the Taliban is a quasi-government, a very ineffective one.
They were terrible at governance.
Yeah, but certainly certainly engaged in terrorism and certainly engaged and is very religious.
Well, here's another similarity. We can talk about al-Qaeda and Hamas and understanding your enemy, which is different than agreeing with what your enemy says as their justification for doing these things, right? Because we know that al-Qaeda, contrary to what President Bush said in that speech on September 20th, 2001, al-Qaeda wasn't attacking the United States because it hated our freedom.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other.
Well, it's true that al-Qaeda probably didn't like those things, but that is not why it attacked the United States. Osama bin Laden was a critic of U.S. foreign policy, if you will. Which is not to say that his interpretations of history and current events was accurate. But when it comes to motivations and intent, it is true that both al-Qaeda and Hamas want to destroy their enemy. Hamas wants to destroy Israel, and al-Qaeda didn't have the capability of doing this, but did want to bring down the United States on itself.
Al-Qaeda's goal on 9/11 was to put sufficient military pressure on the United States to pull out of the Middle East so its client regimes would fall. It's not that they were trying to destroy America. They had a goal in the Middle East. And interestingly, bin Laden's model for some of this was Hezbollah, because Hezbollah bombed the Marine barracks, killed 241 American servicemen in 1983, bombed the U.S. Embassy, and that was the beginning of Hezbollah. Yeah. Applied enough military pressure on the United States and Lebanon, so Ronald Reagan pulled out.
We've been concerned because the Middle East is a powder keg. 4 times in the last 30 years, the Arabs and Israelis have gone to war, and each time the world has teetered near the edge of catastrophe.
And bin Laden saw that as a model. Of course, it was very naive to believe that by attacking Washington and New York, the United States would pull out of the Middle East. In fact, the United States became more engaged in the Middle East than at any time during its history. But the goal was ultimately regime change in countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt for bin Laden by attacking the United States, which didn't make much sense, but that was his strategic rationale.
I got that from Lawrence Wright's book, The Looming Tower, which we've discussed on the show in the past. He says that bin Laden hoped to bring about the political disintegration of the United States by, punching the bully in the nose one more time.
No, I think that's overwrought. I obviously studied this rather carefully, and he believed that the United States was sort of a paper tiger. In fact, that's what he told us when we interviewed him on CNN, similar to the Soviet Union. Bin Laden doesn't care about American domestic politics, or didn't care about it. He cared about his own country, Saudi Arabia. His main goal was to replace the Saudis with some kind of Islamist regime. And he saw the United States as propping up the Saudis. If he attacked the Americans, they would withdraw their support from the Saudis, and then he would have the Islamist utopia he was seeking. He wasn't trying to bring about the political disintegration of the United States. So I don't think there's any evidence of that. Yeah. If you look at bin Laden, the Palestinian issue was front and center of his critique of the United States. And over time, jihadist terrorist groups that has become less and less important. Look at ISIS. It's all about fomenting a sectarian war with the Shia. And they may talk about Jerusalem or Palestine occasionally, but it's really not what their goal was. Their goal was to foment a religious civil war between the Sunni and the Shia in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. But now you'll see, you've seen these jihadist terrorist groups now that suddenly this issue is back on the front burner, but it was for a while on the back burner.
Right. That's right. His mentor was a Palestinian, Osama.
Yeah, and Abdullah Osama, as my understanding was one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was a key Muslim brother in Jordan and before that born in Palestine. For bin Laden, the Palestinian issue is central to him because that's the site of the Al-Quds Mosque, and that's where Prophet Muhammad went to heaven, and the third most holiest site in Islam.
Our proposed solution to this problem was totally off because we didn't quite understand what our opponents' or our enemies' motivations were. When it comes to Israel and Hamas, it's pretty clear what Hamas wants. You could read their charter. It's available online. It is their belief that this sliver of land on the Mediterranean, cannot be negotiated over. And their goal is the destruction of the state of Israel.
Yeah, is that a question?
That was more of a statement, a setup for you to elaborate on.
Their founding documents speak for themselves. And I'm very struck by the fact that, I've talked to a number of urban warfare experts, and they estimate 80 to 90% of the buildings in Gaza City will be either damaged or destroyed. And you look at Mosul after the U.S. and the Iraqi security services went in and defeated ISIS, which was a smaller group than Hamas, in a city about the same of about 2 million, where most of the population had left. The place was completely destroyed. And so, unfortunately, that's what's likely to happen in Gaza. We're seeing it unfold in front of us. Who takes responsibility, not just for aid and humanitarian issues, but also governance and security? Conventional kind of counterinsurgency doctrine would suggest you need one security personnel for every 50 population. So 2 million population, that would be 40,000, largely police force. Where does that police force come from? Is it Arab states? Most of them don't seem to want to take ownership of this problem. Israel's made it very clear it doesn't want to take ownership of Gaza. It withdrew in 2005. That is going to be a very difficult problem.
The United States basically reserved the right to declare war on any country that it deemed was harboring terrorists. And likewise, in this war, we're not quite sure how many other countries Israel might be at war with by the time this is over, because there's the possibility of escalation. Hezbollah has 100,000 rockets. It's not quite clear what Iran wants out of this. I guess what I'm trying to get at, Peter, is we need to understand the limits of military power to affect good outcomes.
I mean, as Secretary Blinken said, the two-state solution is the solution. Still, they are going to destroy much of Gaza, but if they don't have a plan for the day after that involves some kind of political solution, which right now they're obviously not putting forward, they're just sowing the seeds for the next round of conflict. If you look at Iran's influence over the last 2 decades, partly because of our war in Iraq, where we knocked out their principal antagonist, Saddam Hussein, the Lebanese Hezbollah is sort of an arm of the Iranian government. The Houthis in Yemen are supplied and supported by Iran. The Iranian militias in Iraq are supported by Iran, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. Iran has a military presence in Syria, helped Bashar al-Assad win the civil war there. The list goes on and on. So the Iranian influence in the region has become much greater. Will there be a wider war as a result of it? I'm actually skeptical of that, because I think that Hezbollah has good reason not to have a wider war with Israel. In the 2006 war, 1,100 Lebanese were killed, 158 Israelis were killed, billions of dollars of damage were done to Lebanon. The Lebanese economy, as you know, Martin, has basically dematerialized between the banking crisis, the financial crisis, the huge explosion in the port of Beirut. I mean, I was there about a little over a year ago, and the place really feels very different than it did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Hezbollah has fairly significant representation in the Lebanese parliament. They need to be responsive to Lebanese popular opinion. And I don't think there's any great demand in Lebanon to have a rematch of the Israeli-Lebanon war, which inflicted a lot of damage on Lebanon. So if you look at what Nasrallah said on Friday in his speech, he was pretty vague. He said all our options are open, which doesn't mean anything. Yeah. He was at great pains to say that Hezbollah had nothing to do with October 7th, and by implication, Iran had nothing to do with it. Miscalculations happen all the time, but I think that Hezbollah has good reason not to widen the war. Iran, through its proxies, can kind of turn up the heat on Israel and the United States by harassing attacks coming out of the Houthis in Yemen or pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, etc. But that doesn't mean that either Iran or Hezbollah necessarily want to get into a shooting war with the United States. And the United States doesn't want to get in a war with Iran either. I mean that's their stated public position. So there's a reason that 2 aircraft carrier groups and a Ohio class submarine in the region. And I think that it's in everybody's interest not to widen the war.
Oh, absolutely. We'll wrap up with this. All these comparisons have to be set aside. Some are useful, some are not. But fundamentally, the war that's going on now is part of a larger struggle that began in 1947, 1948. We have two peoples who have conflicting and incompatible claims to the same sliver of land, and until there is a resolution of that disputes, we may not see hot war all the time, but we're not going to have peace.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I mean, obviously, with the Oslo Accords, that seemed very promising. And Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated 2 years later by an Israeli right-wing terrorist.
A religious student.
Yeah, I didn't remember that. And then, of course, you also had the Camp David meetings with Bill Clinton and, where the PLO walked away from potentially a reasonably good deal. But the situation just every year gets worse and worse and worse. Well, one thing, of course, is the Abraham Accords are basically, I don't see much future for them. And I think the theory of the case of the Abraham Accords, I was always skeptical of, because what it was basically Israel making peace with its neighbors, its Arab neighbors, which is great. But it was all done above the heads of the Palestinians. They never got anything out of them. If you go back to Jared Kushner, who negotiated these, he was going to get a vast amount of Arab states to invest $50 billion into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, et cetera. And, that never happened. So the theory of the case that if Israel makes peace with its Arab neighbors, somehow that takes care of the Palestinian issue, that turned out to be wrong. I think it was predictably wrong at the time.
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. Americans have known wars, but for the past 136 years, they have been wars on foreign soil, except for one Sunday in 1941. Americans have known the casualties of war, but not at the center of a great city on a peaceful morning. Americans have known surprise attacks, but never before on thousands of civilians. All of this was brought upon us in a single day, and night fell on a different world, a world where freedom itself is under attack.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Israelis and Palestinians came close once to some resolution of their decades-old conflict. It was the Oslo peace process, which started in the early 1990s before collapsing about a decade later. Why didn't it work out? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.